Good evening and welcome to UAF Summer Sessions and the University of Alaska Press Authors Corner. I'm Robert Handon, pinch hitting for UA Press Director Nate Bauer this evening. Thanks to you that are here at UAF's Engineer Learning and Innovation Center for attending. A couple of points I want to, some busy work I want to get out of the way to begin with. The University of Alaska Fairbanks follows a COVID-19 policy which requires face coverings and social distancing inside all buildings for anyone who is not fully vaccinated. Please get vaccinated, by the way, if you haven't yet. And thanks to those who are tuning in to the live stream or video recording later on from Alaska or elsewhere, and for your interest and attention. I want to thank the University of Alaska's Office of Information Technology for JC Ice and also Scott Franzudo. And Michelle Bartlett and Summer Sessions are in for thanks as well for organizing these summer event series free of charge. Thanks to tonight's presenter, especially Jessica Goodfellow and all UA Press authors for agreeing to participate in this reading and the Authors Corner series. I hope you can make it worth their while. If you want to find out more about Jessica's book, it's on the UA Press website at alaska.edu, UA Press, look for Whiteout. We'll have question times following the presentation, and consider any information and details you'd like to hear more about as you listen. And you should use the microphone for any questions in this room, and I'll pass that around. For anyone zooming in, please use the Google Form link on the live stream page below the video pane, or visit bit.ly//author Q&A, that's with no spaces. And also please consult the calendar for the rest of the summer and make plans to attend any other events that interest you. We'll post the rest of the scheduled Authors Corner presentations at the conclusion of tonight's event. Now about Jessica Goodfellow. She grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but has spent the last 20 years in California, Florida, and Japan. She received an MS degree from the California Institute of Technology and an MA in linguistics from the University of New England. Her first book of poetry, The Insomniac's Weather Report by Three Candles Press, won the Three Candles Press First Book Prize and was reissued by Isobar Press in 2014. Her second book, Mendelev's Mandala, is available from Mayapple Press. And her new book, which we'll hear about tonight, Whiteout, is from the University of Alaska Press. And it was completed while she was a writer in residence at Denali National Park and Preserve. She's also the author of a poetry chapbook, A Pilgrim's Guide to Chaos in the Heartland, which won the Concrete Wolf chapbook competition. Her work has appeared in the anthology Best New Poets of 2006, on the website Verse Daily, and has been featured by Garrison Keillor on NPR's The Writer's Almanac. She's also won the Best of American Poetry in 2018, the recipient of the Chad Walsh Poetry Prize from the Bellois Poetry Journal, and her work has been honored with the Lyndon Julian Essay Award, as well as the Sue Lyle Iman Fiction Prize, both from Emory Foundation. Her poem was made into a short movie, Motion Poems Season 6. Jessica currently lives in Japan with her husband and sons. So please welcome Jessica Goodfellow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I am in Japan, where it is about noon on Tuesday. And I'm here today to talk about my book, my recent book, which is called Whiteout. I think, I hope you can see it there. There we go. And the artwork is by Clara Maish. She is an artist based in Alaska, and I think I'll spell her name for you in case you are interested in looking it up. Her work, it's K-L-A-R-A, Clara with a K, and her last name is M-A-I-S-C-H. So this book, Whiteout, it's about my uncle who was killed climbing Mount McKinley or Denali. It was during the writing of this book that President Obama recognized the name of Denali for the mountain. And so I sometimes will be calling it Mount McKinley and sometimes Denali, because I grew up calling it Mount McKinley. And it's a large part of my family's history since my uncle was killed there. So you may have, if you're interested in mountaineering at all, you will have heard about the accident that my uncle died in, because it was, at the time that it happened, it was the largest mountain climbing accident in United States history. I'm sorry to say it's no longer the worst. There's been even a worse one since then as far as loss of life. But this one occurred in 1967. It's well known as the Wilcox Expedition, and the leader, Joe Wilcox, was best friends with my uncle. My uncle's name is Steve Taylor. So there were 12 climbers, and they left to climb Denali in a little bit past the middle of July. And a once in a century kind of storm hit them while they were up there. There were 300-mile-per-hour winds, and the storm lasted about 10 days, and no one, of course, could get up or down to get to them. And everyone who was on upper camp was lost. And the upper camp were 7 of the 12, including my uncle. And he was 22 years old when this happened. He had graduated from university in April of that year, and by the end of July, he was missing and presumed dead. I was at the time 2 years old. So I don't really have a direct recollection of the events. So the book is about how I grew up in the aftermath of this tragedy, and what it's like for a family to grow up without ever being able to retrieve the body of their beloved, and also the family, our family in particular, didn't speak much about it. It happened when I was little, and so when I became conscious of it, there was still, my grandparents and my mother were still in a lot of pain, and they could hardly speak about it, and it sort of calcified in our family into a way that we don't speak about it. And so this book is both about the accident that happened and also about the fact that I grew up in this silence and what that does to family dynamics, and what that does to the imagination of the children who grow up that way. Which is something that most families can relate to. I think a lot of families have some kind of event or relative that isn't spoken of. A lot of families have that. Anyway, so today I want to read you some poems and to talk to you a little bit about some of the pieces in here, and talk to you, as I do, about my uncle and his experience. So the first poem that I'm going to read to you today is called Untraceable, and I'm going to try to show you the title, because there's a whole series of poems in this book which have the word uncle embedded in them. So the first title that I'm going to talk about is Untraceable. So the first UN of Untraceable is the Un of uncle, and then in trace there's a C, so that's the C of uncle, and then the word ends with the LE, untraceable, and that's the LE of uncle. So there are these poems that have the word uncle sort of hidden in them. And the way that we did that, the press and I worked out a way of showing it where the letters uncle are in a light gray print. The color is slightly different. So it says untraceable, and if you look carefully, you'll see uncle. And I don't know if you can see that, the different colors there, but the word uncle is sort of hidden in there, and not everybody notices. Okay, so there's a whole series of those poems in the book, and this is the first of the series. So this poem, Untraceable, is about, in particular, what happened to my uncle, because, of course, we don't know what happened to any of the 7 missing men, but my uncle in particular, we don't know what happened to, because they were at upper camp. The 5 who had summited went down to lower camp, and the 7 who were yet to summit were at upper camp, and they left to summit. But my uncle was having altitude sickness, so he decided not to summit. And so they left him at the upper camp. The other 6 left him at the upper camp, and they went up to summit. Now, when they reached the summit, they were able to radio to the Park Service and tell them that they had summited. And then they never made it back to camp because the storm hit between then. But when they summited, there were only 5, and 6 had left from the camp, and the only 5 summited. And unfortunately, nobody mentioned the reason, either the climbers or the Park Service. Nobody commented on the fact that there were 5 rather than 6. And so what they believe is that one of them had become sick part of the way up, and had decided to turn around and go back to the camp where my uncle was. So after the storm, of course, we don't know whether that climber made it back to camp or not. So after the storm, the Alaska Rescue Team, I think it's called, they sent up some people to have a look, just have a quick look, because another storm was closing in. And so they came up and they could see some things, but they couldn't get to the camp. They certainly couldn't retrieve anything. But some of the things that they saw was there was one body at the camp. And they thought, they of course assumed it was my uncle, because everyone knows that he was at camp. But actually our family and Joe Wilcox, the leader of the expedition, don't believe it was my uncle. We believe it was the other person who had maybe turned around, because the clothing didn't match my uncle's clothing. And then later, my uncle, well, this rescue team also saw my uncle's sleeping bag wrapped around one of those poles that mountain climbers use to mark their paths, but that was down below the upper camp. And they also found his ice axe even below that. So the feeling was that perhaps my uncle had left camp, maybe to get help for the other climber, or maybe because maybe in a lull in the storm. Nobody knows. I mean, basically the story is that nobody knows, but in particular, nobody knows what happened to my uncle, whether he left the camp or whether he was the body at the camp, which was later covered by snow and never found again. 3 other climbers were sighted on the side of the hill, but by those Alaska Rescue Team, but they had to get off the mountain before the next storm hit. And none of this was recovered. It was only cited by these people. So this is a poem about not knowing what happened to my uncle, whether he left the camp, whether he was blown off the mountain, because with the 300-mile-per-hour winds, people could be just lifted up and blown right off the mountain. So it's possible that he was lifted up. Of course, it's always possible that he went into a crevasse. It's possible he was buried there at camp under snow. We don't know. Of course, we don't know about any of them, but just because of the situation, my uncle's particular story is a little bit more noble than everyone else's. So I'm going to read you this poem called Untraceable. It's about that situation of not knowing what happened. And in it, there's a Japanese word. So the Japanese word, I'm going to tell you what the word is and in the poem, and I'm going to define it in the poem. But I just wanted to tell you something about Japanese. In Japanese, if you put 2 characters together, they make a new word, and they may or may not mean the sum of the 2 characters. For example, the word denwa means telephone, but if you look at den, the kanji, the character for den, it means electric, and wa is for talk. So it literally means electric talk. So if you see the word electric and talk next to each other, you think telephone. Nobody actually thinks to themselves, oh, it's electric talk. Everybody thinks, telephone, but they think it in Japanese. So this is true in a lot of Japanese words. So it's true of the word that I use in the poem. And so I'm going to tell you both what the word is, like literally what people think, and then it's also going to be in the poem a list of like the literal definition of what each kanji or each symbol means. Okay, so I hope that's not too confusing. All right, so this is called Untraceable. Either he burrowed under a skin of snow that turned out to be the arch of the foot of the storm, or the storm lulled, so he went for help, stepping through the iced over skylight of the underworld. Or he was wind-snapped like a bed sheet on a clothesline, then loosed, then tossed. Later, his sleeping bag was found wrapped around a pole like a seahorse, tail grasping at eel grasp. limbless against the current. Tatsu no otoshigo, that creature's called in Japanese, child dropped by a dragon. Okay, so Tatsu no Toshigo is the word, means seahorse, but literally it means child dropped by a dragon. Okay, now I'm going to read you another poem from the series that has the word uncle embedded in the title. And this one is called Uncollected. And so you can see that, that the words that spell uncle are there in order in the title of the poem. Okay, okay, Uncollected. They never found his body, we say, and not, they never found him. If seeing is believing what's not seeing, some people I've heard at poetry readings play a drinking game, taking a swig each time the word body turns up in a poem. If they were reading this, they'd be drunk out of their minds by now. That's how we say it, drunk out of their minds, not drunk out of their bodies. Out of his mind with grief, too, they said, when my uncle almost stopped speaking the year after the accident, staring into space and saying nothing. No one could get drunk on that, on the sober silence we cocoon around my uncle's absence. Lost, like the 10 tribes of Israel, like milk teeth, ironically, as that's the one thing my grandfather has left of his beloved son's body, of him. A small box of milk teeth, each a tiny snow-slick mountain, faintly stained with blood. Okay, next I'm going to read you a poem called Morphology. So there's several meanings of the word morphology, and in particular I had two meanings in mind when I wrote this poem. One is the linguistic meaning. So morphology, a morpheme in linguistics is the smallest unit of meaning. So for example, everybody knows the prefix means not, you know, like, so the poem Uncollected means not collected. So everybody knows that. So is a morpheme. It's the smallest meaning of unit of meaning. It's not exactly a word, but it's a meaning, a piece of meaning, a unit of meaning. So that's morphology, is the study of morphemes, the study of units of meaning in linguistics. And then a second meaning of morphology is from geology, and it means how rocks are formed, in particular with regard to erosion, the erosional features. So I'm using both of those ideas, the morphology as about how words are formed and morphology about how rocks or mountains are formed in this poem. And so the title is Morphology. Okay, morphology. So many parts of the mountain are named after the body. The head wall, the lip, the flank, the shoulder, and the brow. The mountain even has a face, where the face of our beloved no more turns toward rumble of far-off avalanche, nor tilts in wonder at the alpenglow. His furrowed brows not found atop a glacier, bent over a chessboard on a day deemed unfit for travel. Nor do his wide, pale eyes flinch when one group heads for the summit, the other leaves for lower camp, while he alone attends the middle on a day no one thought to deem unfit for travel. The mountain and our beloved both had their north faces, which might be why the storm could not tell one from the other, conjoined. So many parts of the mountain are named after the body. This was not our only attempt at incantation, about face incarnation, flesh made word. We also say a river has a mouth and the clock has hands. Potencies we ache to embody, to cast in our own image, like gods. So in that poem, you heard me say that they played chess aboard atop a glacier, and that did happen. They did take a chessboard up with them, and the climbers did. And on one day in particular was not a good day for travel. It seemed, I don't know, the weather was not conducive, and they played chess on that day, which is a sort of an interesting image. Okay, so let's see. Now I think I will read to you Unconsoled, which is another of the uncle poems that has the uncle in the title. So the first part of the book, which I just read to you from, was mostly about the accident and the time when the accident happened. And now I'm going to read to you from the part of the book which is more about being a child who grew up with this story in our family. I remember the first time that I knew about my uncle. So as I said, I was 2 when the accident happened, and my uncle had lived with our family the summer before, the summer between his junior and senior years of college, because he wanted to save money in the summertime and not have to pay any rent. So he lived with my mother, who was a young married woman with 3 young children, and I was the middle child. I was 2. There was no, actually at that point, it was the year before. So I was 1, I had a 2-year-old sister, and I had a brand new baby who was 3 months old. Not my baby, my mother had a baby who was 3 months old. And so my uncle came to stay with us, and my mother had asked him, he was working nights at the post office sorting mail. That was his summer job to save money for school, for his senior year of school. And he worked nights. And so my mother had said to him, like, if you come home and Jessica is awake, could you feed her a bottle? Because of course my mother had an infant, a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. She was exhausted, and she, didn't want to have to wake up if she didn't need to. And so my uncle misunderstood, and he would come home and wake me up to give me a bottle, because he thought that's what he was supposed to do. So I've, even though I don't recall my uncle, I have a feeling that we had a relationship in that way. And also my grandparents did say to me many times that I was a lot like my uncle. So I have a feeling for him, even though I don't recall what happened or recall him. The first time I knew about him, I remember I was about 4 years old, and I was in my mother's room, my parents' room, and there was a toy monkey hanging from like a curtain rod, and I wanted to play with it. And my mother said, no, that's not a toy for playing. And I was like, well, why not? It's a toy. And she said to me that it was the last thing her brother had ever given her. And so it wasn't for playing. And so at that time I said, you don't have a brother, or you have a brother, or something like that. I mean, I was about 4. And then she showed me the picture that was always hanging on the wall of my uncle. And I knew the picture, and that was her brother. And she explained, and that was the first time I really understood that she had a brother, and that he had been lost, and that he was on the mountain still. And at that time I started to have dreams, and I've had this recurring dreams my entire life about my uncle. And in the dreams, I go to Alaska, and I'm trying to go up the mountain, and I'm trying to find my uncle and bring him home to my mother, to make her feel happier. So that's a recurring dream that I've always had. And so I wrote a poem about that recurring dream, and the poem is called Unconsoled. Okay, here it goes. Unconsoled. In my dreams, my uncle rides the glacier like a surfboard, arms wide open like a savior. If he had lived, he might have solved my childhood. He dismounts the mountain, astonished to see me, no longer 2 years old and mittened, hands hampered by love. I'm sorry, I say, we almost never speak of you. It's okay, he says. A snowman is a man built of snow. A snow angel is made by taking snow away. Okay. So now I'd like to read to you what my grandfather heard. It's the poem. The poem is called "What My Grandfather Heard," and it tells the story of how my grandfather and my family found out that my uncle was missing. So, one of our family friends heard it on the radio that 7 climbers were missing on Denali. It was huge news at the time. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It was on, the headlines of all the newspapers. I have a friend from Czechoslovakia, and she's a little bit older than me, so she was 7 or 8 when it happened, and she remembers it being news in Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was worldwide news. But anyway, when it first was announced on the radio, a family friend heard, and that family friend called my mother. and my mother called my grandfather, and that's how my grandparents found out that their son was missing. So this is the story of that, and it's called What My Grandfather Heard, and it has a little epigraph, which is "Oh, the mind has mountains," which is by Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet. Okay, so here we go. What my grandfather heard. My grandfather heard from his married daughter, who heard, sorry about that. Stop, sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't make this turn off. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, my grandfather heard from his married daughter, who'd heard from an old family friend, who'd heard on the radio that his own only son was counted among the missing on Mount McKinley. It was the first intimation of trouble. Except that a few nights before, my grandfather woke in the Chicago dark to the voice of his son calling, "Father, Father, help." His son was, he knew, in Alaska, yet he heard his voice as clearly as fear. My grandfather woke his wife to say, "Our boy, he is in trouble." Born in the first generation to believe in angels and airplanes equally, my grandfather knew breath, hanging white in cold air, could cast shadows on the ground. What he didn't expect was the absence of breath to stain the days with umbra. My grandfather would go on to lose also his hearing, as if his ears couldn't bear one more futile request. Instead, they subtracted the sounds of the world one by one and let rise instead a susurrus in his mind, echoes of an Arctic wind blowing always in him. Okay, so I like to read something called Glacial Erasure. So as you all know, with climate change, there's changes occurring in the mountains. And one of the changes is the melting. In fact, there was a big surge in the Muldrow Glacier this year, I think. So yeah, so there was I think it was the Muldrow Glacier that surged quite suddenly. I guess you can tell me during the question and answer period if I got the wrong glacier. But anyway, you know, one of the concerns is what's going to happen as melting occurs and movement occurs. Are there going to be any of the artifacts that were cited by the Alaska Rescue Team going to show up, or are any of the bodies going to appear? So this is something which, you know, is a concern to my family. And so this is a poem thinking about that, and it's called Glacial Erasure. As he climbed up, the glacier under his feet was inching down. If he'd kept moving, he could have scaled that ice escalator and never noticed. He did not keep moving. 1967. Experts estimated the glacier would one day drift with its accidental stowaways to the lowlands, like Dolly's molten clock sliding over a draped figure, a body recumbent in the persistence of memory. Instead, melting glaciers empty out their pockets, littering the landscape with detritus and dead relatives. The glacier that erased my uncle soon will be erased, unfolded, vacant of weather and weight. Roof becomes floor, become flora of a habitat as fluid as memory. So when I was writing this book, I applied to be a writer in residence at Denali National Park and Preserve, and I was really fortunate to be able to be one of the writers in residence in the year 2016. And so I was able to visit Alaska and do some research and finish up my book while I was there. And so I could stay in a cabin on the park grounds, and it was really, really amazing. And one of the things that happened well, I'm sure all of you are aware that you can't see Denali all that often. I've read that it's either a third of the visitors get a chance to see him, or that it's visible a third of the time. I can't remember what exactly the statistic is, but anyway, it's quite low. So when I went to stay in the park, my older sister went with me. I was allowed to bring one guest with me, and I brought her. And when we were there, we had a 10-day period where we stayed at the cabin, and we were able to see Denali 9 of those days. It was just an astounding number of days. And if you've gone to Denali, you know that there's one road through it, and there's a bus. You can't drive it. We were allowed to drive because of our being an artist in residence, but mostly you take the bus. Even we took the bus most of the time. And when we talked to the bus driver hadn't even seen Denali as many days as we had, because he wasn't on duty the whole 10 days we were there. But he was like, "You've seen it how many days?" He couldn't believe it. We saw it 9 days. It was just astonishing. Of course, it was different. Sometimes we saw it quite clearly, the whole thing. Sometimes we saw, bits of it peeking through. Anyway, I wrote a poem called 9 Views of Denali. It's one for each of the 9 times that I saw, or actually the 9 days. I actually saw it more than 9 times, because some days, of course, I could see it multiple times, and some days I saw it most of the day. But this is for the 9 days. There's a quote, a little epigraph that it begins with, from Clay Dillard, who is a pilot at Talkeetna Air Taxi. We were able to fly up and land on the glacier, or land on the mountain with Talkeetna Air Taxi before we entered the park. So he said, Clay Dillard, the pilot who flew us up there, he said, "The mountains are alive." Okay, so here is 9 views of Denali. 1, the mountains appear through a Venetian blind of clouds, stripes of weather, granite, snow. 2, mountain and sky, the same indigos and whites as the blue marble. Fast moving clouds are too high to hide the peaks, but their shadows sweep across the ridges, the opposite of spotlights. 3, thick clouds hide all but shifting glimpses of the mountain, mottled white and gray as the 15 stones at Ryanji's Zen garden, which from no angle can all be seen at once. 4, the clear blue slate of Wonder Lake twins the sky. Counting the reflection, there are 2 Denalis. My uncle could be anywhere. 5, fish scale moon above Denali at midnight. Iridescent, incandescent, partly darkled, a frozen fire and the spark that has escaped it. 6, wind shuffles the clouds in a cosmic shell game while we wager, under which thunderhead does the summit lie. 7, the mountain's north faces have ridges crisp as datelines, ash blue todays on one side, white nothings on the other. 8, the blank white pages of Denali, Foraker, and Hunter are smudged across their bottom margins by the inky scrawl of smaller ridges, scribbles of unreadable runes. 9, behind us, the park road winds toward the mountain like a fuse. Okay, let's see. So when we were in Alaska, like I said, we also were able to go to Talkeetna, and I suppose most of you probably know that Talkeetna, if you want to climb Denali, you have to register with the Park Service, and the registration place is at the Forest Service in Denali, in Talkeetna, sorry. So my sister and I, we went and we stayed a couple days in Talkeetna before we entered the park, because we knew my uncle had been there. We tried hard to go to places where we were sure he had been, like we drove the park road because we knew he had been there. We went to Wonder Lake Campground because we knew he had camped there, and we were in Talkeetna. Anyway, so in Talkeetna, if you don't know, there's a really colorful and interesting cemetery, and there are really interesting grave markers there. For example, some of the bush pilots who have been killed in the line of duty, their graves are marked by like the propellers of their planes. And there's a wooden pole that's been carved with climbers on it to commemorate all the climbers who've been lost on Denali. And there's also a board listing the names of everybody who's been lost there. So this is a poem about Talkeetna, and it's just called, oh, I'm on the wrong page, just a moment. It's called Talkeetna. Okay. East of the railroad, across from the airstrip, a whitewashed telephone pole has been planted in the cemetery, unconnected, dialing no one. Carved by chainsaw, 2 wooden figures scale the pole, wearing cedar crampons, wielding wooden rope and axe. This is the town that says the last goodbye to mountaineers headed for Denali. Climb high, sleep low is the unofficial motto. The wooden figures embody one end of that spectrum. The graves below disembody the other. Over there is the weatherproofed memorial board, listing year by year, name by name, the mountain's quarry, its claim. 35% are bodies unrecovered. They will never again sleep low. This town that didn't have a bathtub until 1923 has at a local inn a dead man's wall, complete with photos, or more correctly, incomplete with photos. Back at the cemetery, a carved raven tops the pole, the only creature other than human seen at the mountain's highest points, a bird cunning enough to dig up buried caches meant for later. This is a last reminder of what any climber could meet at any time, a thief. Okay, let me check time. Okay, 37. All right, I think I will read maybe 1 or 2 more poems. Maybe I want to leave about maybe 15 minutes for questions. So I'll read 1 or 2 more poems, and then we can see if you have any questions. Okay. Let's see. What shall I read? Okay, this one is called Map of the Disaster Site. We never talk about my uncle, or we rarely talk about my uncle. And there's also 2 books. One was that were written early after the accident. And one book was written by Joe Wilcox, my uncle's best friend, and it's called White Winds. And then the other book was written by Howard Snyder, another climber. And basically there were 2 different climbing teams who had to join together because Howard Snyder's team, one of their members broke a foot or a hand or something and was unable to join them, and then it didn't have enough people to climb, and so they asked to join the other team, my uncle's team, which was led by Joe Wilcox. And so that's how they became 12, a group of 12, and the teams didn't get along very well, and so there was a lot of controversy and blame. Both leaders of the team, of both teams, summited with the first group, and they all survived. They were among the 5 who survived, and they each sort of pointed fingers at each other and blame. There was a lot of blame, and it was very unpleasant. On top of the fact that we had lost such a young person from our family, and so though my parents had 2 copies, my parents had copies of each of those books, and then my grandparents also had copies. I understood from a very young age that we weren't supposed to read those books. And to this day, I haven't read those books, even though I'm an adult woman who could order copies of books. I do go and look on Amazon at those books and think I could order those and my family would never know and I could read them. And I still don't. The taboo is very, very strong. Luckily for me, 2 other books were written in the last 10 years or so. Andy Hall wrote Denali's Howl, and Andy Hall was a son of the park ranger at the time of the accident. So he was a young boy, and he has memories of his own, and he also researched it. And then James Tabor also wrote Forever on the Mountain in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. Anyway, I read both of those books when I was doing research, but I didn't read the 2 books that my family just has a feeling of we shouldn't read. Even though my parents, of course, have read them, and my grandparents have read them, but just the feeling that they gave to us children that we weren't supposed to read them has persisted with me. But anyway, when I read the other two books, there are maps in the books showing, you know, the course where the course that the climbers took, and then showing where things were sighted by the Alaska Rescue Team. And so I was looking at one of those maps, and I wrote a poem about it. It's called Map of the Disaster Site. 1. Here is the Muldrow Glacier, and here are camps 6 and 7. The dotted line running up this site is the route of ascension. Over there is Archdeacon's Tower. Here and here are probable sites of bivouac. This is where his sleeping bag was sighted, but not recovered. It was wrapped around a pole as though a signal to no one. X marks the axe, also seen but not recovered, like the bodies of 3 other climbers. X, 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 schemata of the mountains, stigmata. 2. In theory, a map is useful. It renders 2-dimensional what exists in 3 dimensions, or in this case, no dimensions, unless we're counting time, which is like wearing both shoes on one foot. In fact, a map's convenient, able to be folded up and carried in my pocket, opening and closing like a lung. But in the end, a map is useless. Only gravity's graffiti and snow's slow pentimento. Unrepentant map, no X marks the mountain's fontanelle. Its loosely woven selvage he fell through into the legendless depths of the wild mind, the memory, leaving us only this permanent impermanence, this paper tattoo, breathing in and out the black ink of unknowing. Okay, and let's see the time. Yeah, I should finish up. And then we can talk about if you have questions. So the last poem I'm going to read is another one of the uncle poems that has the word uncle embedded in the title, and it's called Unreachable. And it has an epigraph by Simone de Beauvoir, and her epigraph is, regret has to be useless, or it's not really regret. Unreachable. Rescuers did not find my uncle's body, but they found his ice axe at an icy altitude, impossible to navigate without one. A little higher up, they found my uncle's sleeping bag at an altitude unsurvivable without one. You likely have a pen in purse or pocket. Take it out and write a list of all you need at your present altitude. Next, change altitudes. Now, make another list. The 2 biggest regrets of your life. Take your time, get it right, because here is all you need to know about need. That list of regrets, cross one off. You're going to need that space later. Okay, thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, anything you want to ask me about, please do.
Thank you, Jessica. I'll pass this microphone around, but while people are formulating, in a book that deals with presence and absence so much, I'm curious, how does the editing process work for you? When do you subtract and when do you add?
Well, that's a good question. I think, in fact, when I teach creative writing, and that's what I teach, is there's 2 kinds of editing. There's adding and there's subtracting. And I think for me, I err on the side of putting less in to begin with. So I generally don't have a lot to subtract. I tend to be a little bit terse as I write. One of the things that is interesting in retrospect is when I was in Denali, in the national, when I was a writer in residence, I had to put together a kind of presentation. Well, I had to donate some writings to them, and so I wrote a series of 12 or so poems, and I donated it to them. And a few of those poems made it into the book, and a couple of them that I didn't put in the book, I now wonder why I didn't put in the book. They seem to me like they should have been in there. So that's something that's interesting in retrospect. I'm not even sure why they didn't go in, but these to these, now I look at them, I think, wow, those belong in there. So yeah, for me, it's almost never taking out, because I'm pretty sparse about what I put in the first place. So generally, to me, I have to add things for clarification, or basically when I'm editing, I'm moving words around and trying to replace words with words that have consonants or assonants with other words. It's mostly about sound for me when it gets down to the editing part.
Thank you. I'm going to pass this microphone on to Linda.
Hi, Jessica. This is Linda Shandelmeyer, and I'd like to know how writing this book helped you resolve, you know, what you know and don't know about your uncle. And then I think there's probably something left that is not unresolved. And I wonder if you would, I know that's hard to talk about, but can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so since we never talked about my uncle, I never thought I would write about him at all. And I was in a used bookstore here in Japan. It's hard to get English books here. Well, it's not hard now that we have Amazon, but it's expensive. So I go a lot to this used bookstore, and there was a book in the bookstore about people who are lost in Alaska. And you know, you all live there. You know that a lot of people go there to get lost, and then other people go there, and because of the climate or the wildlife, end up getting lost when they didn't mean to. So that book was about people in that situation, but I didn't know if you know, I thought, could my you know, technically my uncle's lost in Alaska, could he be in this book? And I thought, no, I don't think so. But I didn't buy the book because that taboo about reading books on this situation. And then I kept thinking about the book. I went back a week later, visited the book, still didn't buy it, went back a third time, finally bought the book, read it. Of course, my uncle wasn't in it, but immediately poems just started coming to me about my uncle, which I'd never thought to write. So I wrote a poem about my uncle, and then I sent it off to a literary magazine that publishes me sometimes, and they accepted it immediately. And then I was like, oh no, what have I done? I'm not supposed to read about this. I'm certainly not supposed to write about it. And what am I going to tell my mother? My mother's not a reader of poetry, but she always asks me to tell her when I published anything so that she can see it, because, you know, she's a mother. So I said to my husband, what have I done? And my husband said, well, you know, if you don't tell your mother, she'll never know, because she's not a poetry reader. So I didn't tell her, even though that was really uncomfortable for me, because I had told her that I would tell her, and if I had published something, but I just didn't. But a week or so later, another poem comes along. I sent it off. It gets accepted, published again. Again, didn't tell my mother. This happened 5 or 6, 7 times. And I realized I was not just writing poems, I was writing a book. And I was like, well, I can hide single poems from my mom, but I'm not going to be able to hide a whole book. So I thought, I'm going to have to tell my mother. And I was really, really frightened to tell my mother because of the pain that I thought that it might cause her. So I contacted her and I told her about it. And she said, well, you know, of course I'm in Japan and she's in California. And she said, the next time you visit, I want to talk about this. And I was like, really quite okay. She also said to me, I don't want you to write about my brother's death only. I want you to write about his life. And I didn't know very much about his life because we really don't talk about him. So anyway, the next time I visited my family, I was there, I don't know, 10 days or so, and we never talked about my uncle. And the last night before I was about to leave, you know, we just all avoided it the way we always avoid it. My mother said to me, are we going to talk about my brother or not? And I said, yes, I really want to. And so she sent my dad up to the attic and he brought down these huge boxes full of all the newspaper clippings in the covers of magazines, and then letters people had written, photographs from the expedition, you know, the letters that people wrote in condolence. I mean, just, it was boxes and boxes of stuff. And we went through it for a couple of hours and my mother explained things to me. And then all of a sudden she said, okay, I'm done. I can't talk about this anymore. And she just sort of closed up the way she always had. But it opened talking about it. Then when I applied for the chance to go to Denali, I asked my mother if she wanted to be my guest and go with me. Now, my mother's really too old to go with me, and I knew she was too old to go, but you know, it was just making the offer. And then I took my sister. And my sister and I, when we were there, it was so lovely. we went to, like I said, we went to the Talkeetna air taxi and said that we wanted to go on the mountain. And they said, okay, the weather's not very good, so you might not be able to go. And then we said, well, we're only here for 2 days and we really, 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 really need to go. And we explained, you know, like that I was here doing research for this book and my uncle. And they said, your uncle? And they just, the whole tenor of the conversation changed. And they said, just a minute. And they went into the back and a woman came running out and she was crying. And she said, I was the base camp. I worked at base camp. Did I know your uncle? And she was crying. And I said, no, my uncle died in 1967. I don't think you knew him. And she said, oh no, but I know. And they just said, we will get you on that plane. We will get you on that mountain. We will, you know, and they said, give us your phone number. We are going to call you. We're going to get you up there. And they got us up there. And we went to the Park Service. The Park Service was the same way. Everybody was aware of our family history. Everybody took care to tell us what they knew. We met people who said, you know, I was there. I was at Eielson Visitor Center when they were waiting for news, or here I was here. I mean, people came to tell us their stories. We were invited to Camp Denali, which is like a private camp where people visit and they take tours and things. And we were invited there for a day, and they made sure one of their workers had summited. It was a young woman who had summited the year before, and they said, she's prepared a presentation for you. And she went through her entire trip showing us where, and she said, and she had completely aware of our situation. She said, here is where she's showing us pictures. Here is about where your uncle's axe was. And here's about where, and this is about days so-and-so when your uncle was playing chess. And she totally knew our uncle's story and had totally shown us everything from her trip and correlated it to what she knew about having read books about my uncle. And just everyone we met in Alaska was so, I mean, we spoke more about it there than we'd ever spoken about it growing up. And and to see the most beautiful, such a beautiful, beautiful place was really very healing for my sister and me to feel like, it's if you have to end up somewhere, this is a beautiful place to be, even if you're, without family. And my grandparents, they visited Alaska a number of times after the accident. And they said it just was such a beautiful place. And it was the place they could feel closest to their son. And so, yeah, it was really wonderful and healing. But as you say, there's still like a sense of loss. We're never going to know what happened to him. We're never going to have him back. And if you have ever lost anybody whose body is not recovered, there's a kind of theory of loss, which is by a psychologist called Dr. Pauline Boss. And if you are a person who's ever lost somebody in that way, she talks about how physically they're absent, but psychologically they're still present, and how painful that is for families who are unable to psychologically put them to rest because the physical body is missing. And so I think that's really been true of our family. For example, there was no headstone for my uncle until after my grandparents died. My mother added his name to their gravestone, and it says resting on Mount McKinley. And then it has a 10-day period for his death date. We say his death day is July 17th to July 27th because we don't know when he died during that period. So, having a 10-day death period is, that tells you a lot about what it feels like to have that kind of loss, which isn't going to be resolved. I think if you have one of these unresolved losses, I really do suggest that you look at the work by Dr. Pauline Boss from the University of Minnesota. She helps you understand that you're not going to have closure. It simply isn't going to happen. And there's a different model, a different way to look at your loss. So instead of expecting closure, just expecting that you're going to live with loss that's not closed. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple of other questions from the
Okay.
audience.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Mary, and I really appreciated your book. I don't think I ever I don't know anybody who has lost somebody without recovering the body, but I feel the way you wrote, I feel that I kind of have an idea how someone might feel. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Thank
And
you.
the other part I wanted to ask you, and it kind of relates to the other question, it sounded like it was a healing process for you and maybe your sister.
Uh-huh.
And was it a healing process for your sister and any other members of your family?
Yeah, I think it was I actually have 7 sisters and a brother. So for most of us, we can talk about it. My mother, I don't know. My mother is not a person who shares her emotions. So it's not clear to me whether it was a healing process for her, but we do talk about my uncle a little bit more than we used to. And she bought so many copies that, well, she didn't buy, she asked me for copies of the book because she doesn't understand that I don't get them for free. So she asked me for, like 50 copies, and she gives them out to everybody. She gives them out to all of her friends and all of her relatives. And so I know, even though she'll never say directly, like, this book was helpful to me, or she never has said anything that directly, but I know that at least it's a positive in her life. I don't know that it helped her heal. I wouldn't say that for her because she doesn't say things like that, so I can't know. But at least it was a positive for her.
Yeah, thank you for the book and the readings. I'm an ex-mountain climber and have lost some people on St. Elias and stuff, so I appreciate some of the sense of loss. Although it wasn't a family member, but it was a member of my climbing club for years and with whom I had climbed other mountains. So what I was wondering was, have you visited with any of the survivors that were on that trip?
Okay, so first I'd like to say I'm sorry for your loss. It's devastating, no matter, if you've known a person for a long time, it's devastating whether they're a relative or not. I have not exactly visited with any of the other climbers. So Joe Wilcox, the leader, he, like I said, he was my uncle's best friend, and he survived. And I know that he met my grandparents, and my mother all flew up to Alaska and met Joe at the time of the accident, as they were waiting. And Joe actually came back with my grandparents, and he has suffered a lot of survivor's guilt over the years. And so I have met him as a child a number of times. He would visit my grandparents, and some of the times I happened to be there. But what I really remember the most is that when he came, the children were sent into another room, and then the adults would go sit in the living room, and the kids were told to, go outside, play, go over there, just don't, and I remember one time when I was maybe 12 or so, about that age, and Joe was in the living room sitting with my grandparents, and I was like, I was taking care of, like I said, I have all these brothers and sisters. I had all these younger kids to take care of, and I was getting sort of restless taking care of them. And so I kind of snuck into the kitchen to look into the living room to see like what was happening. And they were sitting there in silence. They weren't speaking at all. They all just sat there in complete silence. And at least that one time, that was what was going on. They were just sitting there, sniffling. That was about 10 years after the accident. So I have met Joe in that way as a child, but I never met him to talk about him. Howard Snyder, the other member of the other leader of the other team, who didn't have a good relationship with Joe or the members of the team. It's his picture. This is on the back of the cover. There's a picture of the climbers. This is my uncle right here, and that's Howard right there. Howard is the one who took this picture, and I needed to contact him in order to have permission to use the picture. And so I had a very hard time finding him. He doesn't seem to want to be found. But I did find someone who had interviewed him at one point, and they were able to give me a kind of hint of how I might find him. And I did eventually find him. And he wrote me a really, really, really lovely letter and said, yes, you can use the photo. And I have another photo of your uncle. And just, talked about something he did for my family in the way of like donation to a charity in my uncle's name. And so then I contacted the first person who had interviewed him to let him know that I'd been able to at least communicate by email with Howard, and at that point I told the interviewer, you know, I had been a little bit nervous to contact Howard because I knew that, you know, there was some animosity between the two teams, and the interviewer said to me, yeah, the reason I gave you a hint of how to contact him is because I think that, you know, over the years, as he's, you know, he was also a young man when it happened, you know, a young man in his 20s, as he's gotten older and had a family and realized the extent of loss of the families who lost family members, you know, he's really mellowed out, and maybe he would want to be warm towards your family, and he would want to give you the permission, you know, as a sort of way of reaching out to your family. And I felt that, and I felt that, but that's the only two experiences I've had with any of the members of the climbing team.
Well, Jessica, I want to thank you so much for taking time on your Tuesday in Japan to be with us, and of course to write such a lovely book.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed coming, and I hope it was interesting. I know poetry's not for everybody, but I hope it was interesting enough for everybody.
Well, it's a very powerful book, and thank you so much.
Thank you.